I know that Nehemiah's network is also partnering with somebody to get supplies to the Ukraine as well. So there are a number of independent Baptist missionaries who are either in or working with people in the Ukraine. And so it's one of those odd things that if you look in history and you look at parts of the world where some of the most corrupt places are, sometimes you find some of God's work really working. It's just like things in China with the repression and everything. There's churches growing in China even with all the repression. They always say that the blood of the martyrs is what waters the growth of the church. And so we see that Ukraine, yes, they've been invaded by Russia. Russia violated the treaty that they entered into the Ukrainians with when they moved the nuclear weapons at the fall of the Soviet Union. Ukraine agreed with Russia to move the nuclear weapons out of the Ukraine into Russia, and Russia agreed to respect Ukrainian territorial integrity and government and not to do anything to harm that. Well, they've broken that, more than once. They broke it under Obama when they annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Now they've done it under Biden, and they're trying to take over the whole country. And so the idea Russia's the aggressor there, but that doesn't mean the Ukrainian government is a paragon of virtue, or that the Ukrainian president is a paragon of virtue. He may be less corrupt than some of them, but the Ukraine is filled with corruption. And so as a consequence, we see that. But there are churches in Ukraine that are growing and have been doing a great work for the Lord. So there are some good people in the country. And it's just like with any place, there may be corrupt leaders, there may be corruption in business and society, but God still has his people there. And there's a growing group of Christians in Ukraine who are victims in all of this. And so we need to pray for the believers. And there's some in Russia that are being affected by this as well. So we certainly pray. And like you said, they're getting some relief into some of these areas. What was that? Food for the Poor. I was talking about. Purse is there too. It's Samaritan's Purse. Food for the Poor advertises on Salem Network. So 1220 and 1420 or in those stations.
$88 to feed a kid for a year. Drill a well or something that could drink water for life.
Yeah, they've got a number of things where they can do that, because in some of the places, especially when you get into some of the third world countries, and Ukraine isn't exactly a third world country. It's
a breadbasket.
Yes.
Of Europe. The thing is, they're not planting any crops. That means there will be no harvest. There could be bad news like the 30s.
Yes, because see, back in the 30s, the Soviets, what was it? Joseph Stalin was systematically starving the Ukrainians into submission, purposely confiscating any food that they could find in things. And that's a hallmark of communism. Remember the Band-Aid stuff back in the 80s over in, what was it, Ethiopia, wasn't it? I think it was. All of that was fictitious. And the people raising the money on that knew that it was. It was the communists that were taking over the country there that were stealing the food and driving the farmers off the land. It was I would say man-made, but it's a communist-caused famine, just like the famine in the 30s was in Ukraine. And they do that on purpose. They use food and starvation as a tool to manipulate and control. This is what communism does. It doesn't matter what somebody in an Ivy League tower says about communism. This is the reality of communism. Look what happened in Venezuela, one of the most wealthy countries in the Western Hemisphere. And Gus of East Coast Pizza advertises on their program. He's got family members that made fortunes in Venezuela from Lebanon. And they retired, thankfully, before Chavez came to power. And they retired and went back to Lebanon and built huge estates, mansions, because of the fortune that they made working in Lebanon or in Venezuela. In Venezuela, you don't see too many pets today because they're all being eaten because people are starving to death. And in North Korea, same thing. They use starvation to starve people into submission. People who are weak and hungry are much easier to control, much easier to manipulate than people who are, full and well, well fed and doing well. So this is no surprise that what's happening, but just simply the fact, like you said, it's the breadbasket of Europe, one of the largest grain producing countries in the world. There in Ukraine, and they supply a lot of wheat and a lot of other agricultural products to Europe and to Africa and to parts of Asia. You say, well, the American farmer will just fill in the gaps. Well, what happens if our harvest isn't as good this year?
They're 20% of the world's food market.
Yeah, 20%. Okay. Now, yes, can America step up production? Yes, but there's a cost.
And we need fertilizer.
We need fertilizer and also what else?
Yes.
Fuel.
Yeah.
You got to have fuel. And if a farmer is faced with not being able to find fertilizer or afford what he can find and cannot afford the fuel to work the land up, plant the crops, care for the crops, and harvest the crops, he's not going to plant as much. And as a consequence, yield in America could conceivably drop. And this is what you see.
Hey, I wanted to bring up, I brought up a couple weeks ago, and it got my attention. The Ukrainians gave their nuclear weapons to Russia back in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And Russia promised we'll take.
Spread, but it was part of Soviet.
Yeah,
And-
you see it now during the
Mm-hmm.
Russia's,
So-
everybody thought
Russia's taking good.
They're hesitant to donate to anybody anymore because there's so much corruption
Yes.
when it comes to where's this money going? Ukraine,
Yeah.
like you mentioned, is not exactly in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood over
Mhm.
the last number of years.
Well, and you brought up another good point there too, the corruption, not knowing what to do, because remember back 9/11, all those charity groups that came up to help people out and help victims and all that, a number of Islamic terrorist groups were behind those appeals for money back then.
Yeah.
And a lot of people thought they were given to help the victims of 9/11. They were actually giving to help buy stuff for groups like Hezbollah, Al Qaeda, Hamas, any number of Islamic terror groups. Well, right now, what we have happening, Russia and China are setting up fake charitable contribution sites. You think you're giving money to help not just Ukraine, but elsewhere. It's going to China, it's going to Russia.
They're tax deductible.
Yeah, they do them through shell companies and such. But what happens then is well-meaning people give, and it goes to causes that you really don't want it to go to. That's where like Food for the Poor, Samaritan's Purse, some of those types of organizations that are a little more established, you know where it's going. Nehemiah's network locally here.
Sanctions don't do any good.
Yeah, sanctions don't do good. But Nehemiah's network up here right in the Cleveland area, we know who they are. And you know that if you give to those types of places, you know where it's going. And that's where the Russians, the Chinese, and it's not just Russia and China, it's the North Koreans, it's the Cubans, probably the Venezuelans, the Iranians, whoever. They know that Americans in general are giving people. We're a giving society. That's because of our Judeo-Christian roots. We have a charitable ethic in this country that's really more than much of the rest of the world. I remember back after the tsunami that devastated there in the Indian Ocean and parts of going in towards the Pacific there, that a number of groups were in there. Samaritan's Purse was there, Feed the Poor was there, Red Cross was there. Some of the Muslim groups came in kind of almost like they were shamed into coming. They came in later and then complained that the Red Cross had crosses and that Samaritan's Purse was, representing Christ. And they were trying to tell them, you can't do that while you're giving them aid. Because the Muslim group was the Red Crescent, and it's got the Red Crescent. These are Muslim countries. You can't represent the cross. But there was a political official from, I think it was Denmark or Norway, trying to shame Americans for not giving other people in the world to help the victims of that tsunami out. But what he was complaining about was that we weren't raising taxes to send money over there. See, we were giving it to them directly. Many European countries, the people don't give much because they have high taxes and the government decides where it's going to go. Now, let's bring this in a little bit different area back into the church. We're an independent Baptist church, okay? When we want to give to something, we give directly to that. We have a missionary that we want to help out, we give them directly. It goes directly to them. Southern Baptists do it differently. This is one of the reasons that I'm not a Southern Baptist. The Southern Baptist Convention, you don't give directly to a missionary. Instead, you give to the cooperative fund, and collectively the Southern Baptist Convention, through their mission board or whatever group that's overseeing the money that you're giving, because it might be going to help a school out. Because some people, they'll say, well, here's a Bible school, I want to help them out, here's some money to help them out. We give directly to that school, just like we give directly to a missionary. They don't. It goes into the cooperative fund, and then the people who oversee or the missions outreach wing of the convention, they make. You might have seen somebody who's working in Ukraine and you want to help them, you give it to the cooperative fund, and instead they send it to China. It might be going to a good work, but it's not where you wanted it to go. You have no control. Whereas
God does. That's where an amount of faith is involved.
Well, yeah,
you
but
might not be able to do the homework on every organization.
Yeah.
You might want to try and just trust that the Lord's going to lead it to where.
Well, you hope, but the problem that happens, reality being what it is, politics within the convention has a lot to do with where it goes and how much goes there. And you have nothing. If God is, but with the independent approach, you know where it goes. You know the missionary that it's going to. You've met him. He's perhaps been in your church, showed you pictures of the work that he's doing, right, talked with you, answered questions directly. A lot of people in the Southern Baptist Convention have never met a missionary. Not everybody's not in that case, but a lot of them have not. Surprising number have never met a missionary because they don't generally go to all these different churches because they don't have to. And same with some of the schools. Usually, Cleveland Baptist has Heritage Baptist Institute. And you say, well, I know where they're at. I can go see them. Or I could go down to Massillon Baptist College at Massillon Baptist Temple. And I could go see it. And I could say, I like what you're doing here. Here's some money to help out. Or you could even say, I want to help some student that's here that needs help with their books. Let me give you some money to pay for student books. Or whatever you want. You have control. Whereas, you see what I'm saying? What I'm getting at is, I was sort of making an analogy there. This Danish politician or whoever he was saying he didn't like that Americans gave directly. He wanted it to go to the UN so that the globalists could decide where your money was going to go. And see, this is the whole big government thing. They don't want you deciding where you're going to live. They don't want you deciding where you're going to work. They don't want you deciding even who you're going to marry in many cases. They don't want you deciding how many children you're going to have. They don't want you deciding what kind of car you're going to have. They want to dictate all of that to you. You know, if you remember when you were little on the playground at school, there was always some kids that want to tell everybody else what to do. Well, they're globalists today. Yeah, that's what they are. They became globalists. They still want to tell everybody what to do. I can remember that. I had a couple of friends. We'd be out doing our own thing in a far corner of the playground, and these other kids would get mad at us because we were doing something that they didn't tell us to do. Like, who cares? Well, they did, apparently. They get mad at us. And they grew up and became globalists, and they still want to tell you what to do. And they still get mad at you if you don't do, walk into a place that believes in the mask mandate and see what happens. They get mad at you, don't they? Some of these people. If you choose to do that, that's fine. But they don't want you to have that choice. They don't want you to have any choice at all. They want to dictate everything. And so that's all a part of the globalist society, the Great Reset. It's all a part of the mystery of iniquity that's preparing the way for the Antichrist and all that. And
We were just talking about that, and I may have asked this months ago, but is the Great Reset or the New World Order, is it biblical anywhere? I know in order for the Antichrist to take over, obviously everybody has to be under one rule. But we were just talking about that, and I said, I think I asked that months ago, but I can't remember what I had for breakfast today, so I'm trying to remember what I had.
I'm sorry, who are you? No.
Said months ago.
Yeah, well, Revelation 13, look at that. When they bring that mark of the beast into effect, look what he says. It says in verse number 16, Revelation 13, verse number 16, and this is the false prophet. Interestingly, I just saw an article last night saying, is Pope John, whatever his name is, Pope Francis rather, is Pope Francis the false prophet? And it was a whole article on that. It was late at night, so I didn't get a chance to read the whole thing. So it's one of those ones that I saw that I meant to go back to and I haven't as yet, but thought it was kind of interesting. But talking about the false prophet here in Revelation 13, verse 16, says, and he causeth all. Now, all is referring to everybody in the world that he has control over, because there's a world government established led by the Antichrist. And the false prophet here says, and he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell save that he had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. And so this is a part of the world government. All right there talks about the whole world. Elsewhere we see where he has the 10 kingdoms, and he sets it up. And it's interesting, since the 1970s, I've been reading where these different globalist groups, they almost always, not all the time, but the majority of times that I've seen this, they divide the world into 10 governing regions or 10 administrative regions. And these are different groups. This isn't all the same group. And I've been seeing this pattern since the 1970s when I first started following this. 10 regions, 10 regions, 10 regions. Why 10? Well, in the Bible, there's 10 regions. There's 10 kingdoms. And those 10 kingdoms are ruled over by the beast or the Antichrist. So that's the world government that we have. Did you have your hand up, Cliff, earlier? Oh, I thought you had your hand up a minute ago. So, but yeah, so this is what's going to happen. Now, will everything go smoothly? Obviously not, because the Bible indicates that 3 of those regions, 3 of those kings will have to be put down. They'll have a problem, and speculate on different things as to what happens, but it is pretty clear. And also remember back in Daniel, when if you go back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel, it's early in Daniel. Let's see. Daniel chapter 4. Let's try that. Let's see. Let's see if that's the right dream. No, that's not the right dream. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 2. That's the right dream. Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he loses the dream, and he demands that his wise men tell him what the dream was and interpret it because it's really bothered him. Now, Daniel, along with 3 of his friends, had been taken from Israel, and they were being raised in Babylon, and they were being trained in all of the knowledge of the Babylonians, and they were in with the wise men. They were being trained to be advisors and things like that. And as they were there, the Bible says that, or it tells us about the dream, and nobody could interpret it. And so he said, all these wise men that we got in there, nobody's doing it. You're all a bunch of liars and con artists. I'm obviously paraphrasing. And just kill them all. And so the guard comes and tells Daniel and his friends that what's going to happen. He says, wait a minute. Let us pray about it. And they do. God gives him the answer to the dream. So we pick that up in Daniel chapter 2, verse 31. Thou, O king, sawest and beheld a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut off or cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So we have this happening here, and Daniel describes the dream here. And then in verse 36, and give me just a moment here, he begins to give the interpretation of it. Let me just take care of something real quick here before I forget. All right. All right, just 2 seconds here. I just got to catch this over here. I get caught up with what I was supposed to be doing earlier. All right, there we go. All right, so in verse 36, he gives the interpretation. God told him what the dream was, and now he's telling him, he told him what it means, and so Daniel's sharing this with Nebuchadnezzar. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory, and wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given unto thee. I'm sorry, I'm trying to see where I'm reading here. Into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. So the image has a head of gold. And this is Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, this first of these kingdoms, that doesn't mean he's the only kingdom that ever existed before this time, but a head of gold. And if you notice, as you go down the image, the precious metals, we start with gold, next thing silver, that it becomes more base metal as you go down. And it also reflects some other things, because in Babylon, whatever the king said, that was it. What the king said went. Nothing could overrule the king. But when you got to the Media Persians, the king was bound by the law. If something was said and it was, remember Daniel in the lion's den, king wanted to release them. And they said, hey, king, you can't do it. You already decreed. You're bound by the law. So he's inferior to the gold, that's silver. And again, that's the next thing there. Verse 39, and after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. And that, of course, is the silver kingdom, which was the Media Persians. And if you notice, that was the breast and arms of silver, the Media Persians, the Medes and the Persians, like the two arms crossed together or brought together because they came together as one kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. And by the way, the Persians are today the Iranians. The Medes are the Kurds. That's who the Medes are today, the Kurds. So we have another third kingdom here in verse 39 of brass. And again, that's the belly and his thighs of brass. And of course, the brass represents Greece. Alexander the Great brought the various Greek city-states together and united them. He began conquering the known world, and he defeated the Medes and the Persians, and he became the third empire. And then we have the Roman Empire, and which is the fourth kingdom. And it says the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all things, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And the Roman Empire was known for their iron shields, their iron swords, their iron spears. They employed iron more so than those that went before them. And the interesting thing, too, the Greeks went back to a single country, Greece, belly of brass, but then it began to divide at the end, thighs. And then by the time you get to the Romans, there's two legs of iron. Well, the Roman Empire was divided into the Eastern and the Western Roman Empires. The Eastern Roman Empire was headquartered in what's Istanbul, was Constantinople, and the Western was headquartered in Rome. So you had the two legs, the Eastern and the Western. And so in fact, when the Orthodox broke away from the Catholic Church, the Orthodox was largely in the Eastern Roman Empire remnants. And the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, was largely in the Western Roman Empire remnants. So then you notice that it goes down to the feet with the mixed iron and clay. And that's where you get the 10 toes representing the 10 nations or the 10 kingdoms that we see there. And there's some other details with the clay and the iron mixed, and people have speculated on that. One being it's diverse because the iron and clay are there together, but they're not mixed. I also heard somebody say, well, in ceramics, they mix metal and clay together and they produce something that's stronger than either one. But whatever the case is, the 10 toes shows us that corresponds to the 10 kingdoms that we see during the tribulation period. And that's where we get the 10 regions or whatever that'll rule the world, that the world will be divided into. This is basically where I've looked at this since I started looking at this in the 70s. I kind of came to that sort of conclusion because at the time people were saying the Roman Empire would be revived and the European Economic Union started out as the common market, whatever, would be the revived Roman. There would be only 10 nations, and it soon swelled to over 10 nations. And so people were speculating, well, they're going to lose some because there's only supposed to be 10. But you have all these globalist groups that have, for over 100 years, as far as I can tell, have been dividing the world into 10 governing regions. Well, if you're familiar with the term Occam's razor, Occam was sort of a scientific philosopher type guy. I'm trying to remember.
The simplest explanation.
Yeah. Yeah. When did he live? Was he back in the 1600s, 1500s, something like that? Anyway, he was back, one of them guys back then. But yeah, what Bob said, the simplest explanation, usually, not all the time, but usually the simplest explanation is best. For instance, I have a cup of water and it's sitting right here. And if it got knocked over and water flooded across here and the cup was laying there, most people would look at it and say, well, it's wet because the cup got knocked over. That would be an example of Occam's razor, as opposed to coming in here and saying, well,